Some neighborhoods promise peace. Others promise order. But when the people in charge decide the rules only apply to everyone else, peace becomes pressure. Ethan moved into a quiet HOA community, believing the rules would protect him. Instead, one silent decision made his own home harder to live in, and every polite request for help was met with a smile and a fine. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't break a single rule. He did something far more dangerous. He listened.
He documented.
And he waited. Because when power hides behind paperwork, sometimes the quietest response exposes everything. This is the story of an HOA that thought no one would push back, and the homeowner who let their own rules undo them. The neighborhood had been built to look peaceful on purpose. That was the first thing Ethan Hale noticed when he moved in. Not just peaceful in the casual sense, but carefully peaceful. As if someone had measured the distance between houses to prevent raised voices from carrying too far. As if the trees had been planted where they were to soften arguments before they ever began. Every lawn ended at the same invisible line. Every mailbox stood at the same angle. Every porch light glowed with the same warm tone after sunset. It was a neighborhood that didn't tolerate surprises. After everything Ethan had been through, that was exactly what he wanted. He had arrived 3 years earlier with a rented truck, a half-filled house, and a quiet determination not to start over again after this. The divorce had been clean on paper, but heavy in every other way. Selling his old home closer to the city felt like shedding a skin he no longer fit into. This place promised calm. The HOA brochure had said so. A community built on shared responsibility, clear rules, and mutual respect. The words had sounded solid, reliable, and for a while they were. The welcome. Marilyn Cross introduced herself the day Ethan moved in. She appeared at his driveway just as he was wrestling a box labeled kitchen, fragile out of the truck. She wore a light cardigan despite the heat, her hair neatly arranged, her posture straight in a way that suggested she never slouched, not even at home. "Welcome to Brookstone Ridge," she said warmly, extending her hand.
I'm Marilyn,
HOA president. Her smile was practiced but not unkind. The kind of smile that suggested she was very good at meetings. "We like to keep things running smoothly here," she added, glancing briefly at the truck, then back to him. "If you need anything, just reach out." Ethan thanked her. They exchanged pleasantries. She handed him a welcome packet thicker than most instruction manuals he'd owned. As she walked away, he felt oddly reassured. Someone's paying attention, he thought. At the time, that felt like a good thing. The first signs. The first issue was so small Ethan didn't even register it as a problem. The kitchen sink drained a little slower than usual. Not enough to call anyone. Not enough to mention. Just a moment where the water hesitated before disappearing, like it was reconsidering. He shrugged it off. The second sign came a week later. The washing machine paused mid-cycle, hummed softly, then resumed as if nothing had happened. Again, nothing alarming. Houses made noises. Systems aged. These things happened. But over the next few weeks, the house began to feel resistant. Showering took longer. Laundry felt unpredictable. The normal rhythms of daily life no longer flowed the way they should. It was subtle. That was the unsettling part. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just a quiet sense that something beneath the surface wasn't cooperating. The letter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Thin envelope.
HOA logo.
Typed address. Ethan opened it at the kitchen counter, one hand still holding his coffee. "Dear Mr. Hale, as part of routine neighborhood maintenance, we've identified a potential issue related to your property's utility connection. At this time, no action is required on your part. Thank you for your cooperation." That was it.
No explanation.
No contact number. No details. He read it twice. Then again. "Potential issue," he muttered. He checked the date. The same week the problems had worsened. That evening, the house felt heavier than ever. Ethan sat at his kitchen table longer than usual, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, the hum of appliances, the faint sounds of neighbors settling in for the night. The house wasn't broken, but it wasn't right.
Reaching out.
Ethan did what he always did when something felt off. He reached out calmly. He called the HOA office the next morning. Voicemail. He left a polite message. No response. He emailed. Nothing. When he finally caught Marilyn after a monthly HOA meeting, standing near the folding tables organizing papers, she greeted him like an old friend. "Oh, Ethan," she said lightly when he mentioned the letter. "That's nothing to worry about. Just routine checks." "But the timing," he began. She tilted her head slightly. "Correlation isn't causation," she said gently, as if explaining something simple to a child. Her smile stayed in place. Her eyes didn't. Ethan walked home uneasy. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood felt less welcoming. The slow decline. Over the next few days, living in the house became uncomfortable in ways that were hard to explain to anyone else. Not dramatic. Not embarrassing. Just difficult. Tasks that should have taken minutes stretched longer. Daily routines required planning around unpredictability. Sleep became lighter. Mornings more tense. Ethan tried not to think about it too much. But the house had stopped feeling like refuge. And when your home stops feeling like refuge, everything else feels louder. The second plumber. The HOA's recommended service never returned his calls. So Ethan hired his own plumber. An older man. Quiet. Careful. No branding on the truck. He inspected slowly. Methodically. When he finally stood up, he didn't rush to speak. "This wasn't neglect," the man said at last. Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" The plumber wiped his hands on a rag, choosing his words carefully.
"Someone interfered," he said.
This didn't happen naturally. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller. Ethan stared at the wall, then back at the man. "Are you sure?" The plumber nodded once. "I've seen this before." The realization. That night, Ethan sat alone in his living room, the lights off except for a lamp in the corner. He replayed every interaction, every email, every smile, the letter, the timing, the denial. This wasn't maintenance. This was control. And somewhere in the quiet neighborhood designed to prevent conflict, Ethan understood something crucial. He wasn't dealing with a broken system. He was dealing with a person who believed rules were weapons. The clock ticked. Outside, the streetlights glowed evenly, just like they always had. And beneath it all, something unseen had been deliberately blocked. After the plumber left, Ethan didn't move for a long time. He stayed at the kitchen table, hands resting flat against the wood, staring at nothing in particular. The house felt different now, not just uncomfortable but exposed. Like a quiet truth had been spoken out loud, and everything else was waiting to see what he'd do with it. Someone had interfered. Not accidentally. Not carelessly. Deliberately. Ethan wasn't angry yet. That surprised him. What he felt instead was something heavier and slower. The sinking realization that the rules he trusted might only exist for people who weren't in charge. Doing things the right way. Ethan believed in procedure. That belief hadn't come from the HOA. It came from years of work, shared projects, and a marriage that had ultimately failed not because of chaos, but because of unspoken expectations. So he did what he always did when something went wrong. He followed the rules. The HOA bylaws were clear. Maintenance concerns went through formal channels. Documentation was encouraged. Responses were required within a specific time frame.
He drafted an email that night. Calm. Polite.
Detailed.
No accusations. No emotion.
Just facts and dates. He attached the plumber's invoice. He asked for clarification regarding the routine maintenance mentioned in the letter. Then he waited. 3 days passed. Nothing. On the 4th day, he sent a follow-up. Still nothing. By the end of the week, the silence felt intentional. The first fine. The fine arrived without warning. Another thin envelope. Another neutral font. Notice of violation. Excessive communication with the HOA regarding non-emergency matters. Ethan read it twice, then laughed quietly to himself. Excessive, he repeated. He checked his sent folder. 2 emails. 1 voicemail. That was excessive? The fine wasn't large. That wasn't the point. The message was, "Stop. The neighborhood shifts." It didn't take long for the neighborhood to change. It was subtle at first. The man who usually waved during morning walks looked down at his phone instead. The couple across the street stopped lingering outside when Ethan came home. Conversations lowered in volume when he passed. At the mailbox one afternoon, a woman from 2 houses down hesitated before speaking. "You should be careful," she said softly, eyes scanning the street. "They don't like trouble." "I'm not causing trouble," Ethan replied. She offered a thin smile. "That's what everyone says at first." The HOA meeting. Ethan attended the next HOA meeting determined to stay calm. The room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. Folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows. Marilyn sat at the front, posture straight, hands folded neatly in front of her. When Ethan raised his hand, the room went quiet. He spoke carefully. Asked about maintenance records. Asked about timelines. Asked why his messages hadn't been returned. Marilyn smiled. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice smooth and measured, "we can't prioritize individual inconveniences over community needs." "Inconvenience," Ethan repeated. Her smile tightened slightly. "These systems are complex," she continued. "Sometimes patience is required." The board members nodded. No one met Ethan's eyes. He sat down slowly. For the first time, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't mismanagement. This was dismissal. Life becomes smaller. Living in the house grew harder, not in dramatic ways, but in constant ones. Ethan adjusted his routines, planned his days around unpredictability, avoided having anyone over, not because he was ashamed, because he was tired. Every small task required thought. Every moment at home reminded him that something was wrong, and that the people responsible had decided it didn't matter. Sleep came in pieces. His thoughts circled the same questions. Why me? What did I do wrong?
How far does this go?
The second fine. The second fine came faster. This time for failure to comply with HOA guidance. No guidance had been given. Ethan stared at the notice, feeling something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not anger.
Clarity.
The archive. That night, Ethan opened the HOA portal and kept clicking. Old documents. Archived PDFs. Meeting minutes no one read anymore. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for understanding. Hours passed. Then he found something strange. An outdated maintenance map. Marked obsolete. Never updated. It showed shared connections between properties. Infrastructure designed decades earlier, before the neighborhood had expanded. Ethan leaned closer. Followed the lines. One line ran from his property, straight beneath the street, toward the largest house in the development. Marilyn's house. Ethan sat back slowly. The room felt very quiet. The shift. Everything made sense now. The confidence. The dismissals. The silence. The rules weren't broken. They were selectively enforced. Ethan didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. For the first time since this began, he wasn't reacting. He was preparing. Choosing silence. The next morning, Ethan did something unexpected. He stopped reaching out.
No emails.
No calls.
No complaints.
The HOA noticed immediately. Marilyn sent a brief message checking in. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he started organizing.
Dates.
Documents. Invoices. Maps. He read city codes. Learned procedures. Took notes. Everything he did was quiet. Everything he did was legal. The weight of waiting. Weeks passed. The house remained difficult, but Ethan endured. Because now he understood something Marilyn didn't. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. And behind a wall of paper and polite language, Ethan Hale was no longer asking for help. He was building a case. Ethan's silence did not go unnoticed. In a neighborhood where everything was tracked, logged, and regulated, silence stood out more than noise ever could. For weeks, Marilyn Cross had grown accustomed to Ethan's presence in her inbox. His messages were polite,
Structured.
predictable. They had become part of her routine, easy to ignore, easier to dismiss. And then, suddenly, they stopped.
No emails. No voice emails.
No questions at meetings. At first, Marilyn felt relieved. Then she felt uneasy. A different kind of morning. Ethan's mornings changed. He woke earlier now, not out of stress, but intention. He brewed his coffee slowly, standing at the counter instead of rushing through his routine. He stopped trying to fix what couldn't yet be fixed. Instead, he observed. The house was still difficult to live in. That hadn't changed. But Ethan had changed how he moved through it. He adapted without complaint, without record. Because now, every bit of his energy went elsewhere. He created a system. A folder on his computer. Another in a drawer. Printed copies. Digital backups. Everything had a place. Dates were highlighted. Timelines aligned. Contradictions noted. He wasn't emotional when he worked. He was calm. Learning the language of authority. Ethan began reading city regulations the way some people read novels. He learned which departments handled what. Which inspections required notice. Which didn't. Which complaints triggered reviews, and which were quietly ignored. He learned that cities didn't respond to anger. They responded to patterns. And patterns, Ethan realized, were something he already had. He never contacted the city directly. Not yet. First, he learned how they thought. Marilyn feels the shift. Marilyn sent a short email. Just checking in. Haven't heard from you lately. Hope everything is resolving. Ethan read it once. He didn't reply. That bothered her more than a dozen complaints ever had. She followed up a week later. This time, her tone was firmer. More official. Ethan archived it. The power dynamic had shifted and Marilyn felt it, even if she couldn't explain why. The neighborhood notices too. People began talking again. Quietly. One evening, as Ethan retrieved his mail, the man from across the street lingered nearby. Everything okay? He asked casually. Ethan nodded. Working through it. The man hesitated. They don't usually let things go this long, he said. Ethan offered a small smile. Maybe they think it's handled. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Building without confrontation. Ethan contacted professionals, but not in the way Marilyn expected. He didn't accuse the HOA. He asked questions. Neutral ones. He requested information on shared infrastructure, on inspection protocols, on historical compliance. Every response was logged. Every document was added to the growing archive. When answers contradicted HOA statements, Ethan didn't react. He simply noted it. Marilyn tightens the grip. The fines resumed. Smaller now. More frequent. Minor infractions. Technicalities. Ethan paid them immediately.
No protest.
No appeal. That confused Marilyn. She escalated. New notices. New warnings. Each one slightly more aggressive than the last. Each one slightly sloppier. She was rushing. Ethan wasn't. The first mistake. During a routine HOA update email, Marilyn referenced maintenance work that hadn't occurred. Ethan noticed. He cross-checked. It was false. He didn't respond. But the error sat in his records like a quiet alarm. The weight of patience. Living this way wasn't easy. There were nights when Ethan stared at the ceiling, wondering how long he could sustain this balance. Wondering if he was wrong. If he was imagining patterns where none existed. But then he would return to the documents. And the clarity came back. Facts didn't change.
People did.
The inspection request. Ethan didn't request an inspection. He requested clarification. Through the proper channel. With the proper language. That request, carefully worded and completely neutral, triggered a chain reaction he'd anticipated. A compliance review was scheduled. Not just for his property. For the system. The notice was public. The date was set. Marilyn reads the notice. Marilyn read the email twice. Then again. She called a board member. Then another. Her tone shifted from confident to sharp. Meetings were called. Agendas rewritten. For the first time, Marilyn wasn't controlling the process. She was reacting to it. The calm before exposure. Ethan received the same notice. He read it once. Then closed his laptop. For the first time in months, he slept through the night. Not because the house had changed, but because the direction had. The inspection notice changed the atmosphere of the neighborhood before anyone said a word about it. It appeared first as a line in inboxes, then as a printed page on bulletin boards, then as quiet conversations between neighbors who suddenly remembered they had questions. A full systems compliance review. City approved. Externally managed.
Non negoziable.
It was the kind of process that didn't care about titles. The week before, Marilyn Cross spent the week before the inspection in constant motion. Emails went out daily, sometimes twice a day. Reminders, clarifications, reassurances that everything was under control. Her tone was calm on the surface, but beneath it, the precision she once had was gone. Meeting agendas changed last minute. Board members were asked to align messaging. Old records were suddenly requested, then quietly withdrawn. Ethan watched it all from a distance. He didn't interfere.
He didn't comment.
He simply prepared. Inspection morning. The morning of the inspection arrived without drama.
No sirens. No announcements.
Just two unmarked vehicles pulling into the neighborhood shortly after sunrise. The inspectors moved efficiently, clipboards in hand, neutral expressions, no interest in gossip or history. They followed procedure. Ethan greeted them politely when they reached his property. He answered questions directly, provided documentation when asked. Nothing more, nothing less. Marilyn arrived later. She wore a blazer instead of her usual cardigan. Her smile was wider than normal, her voice slightly louder. She introduced herself to the inspectors immediately. "I'll be available for anything you need," she said. They nodded and continued working. The records. The first request was simple. Maintenance documentation. Marilyn handed over a folder. Organized, labeled, prepared. The inspectors reviewed it quietly. Then they asked a second question. About older records. About infrastructure maps. About shared systems. Marilyn hesitated. Just for a moment. Ethan noticed. Ethan's turn. When asked, Ethan provided his archive.
Dates.
Emails. Invoices. Publicly obtained documents. Nothing emotional. Just complete. One inspector paused longer over a particular map. An outdated one. The one labeled obsolete. The one Ethan had found weeks earlier. "Can you explain this?" the inspector asked, looking at Marilyn.
She leaned in.
Her expression changed. The cracks appear. Marilyn spoke carefully. "That map is no longer relevant," she said. "The system was updated." The inspector nodded. "And the documentation for that update?" Silence. Marilyn smiled. "I'll have to locate it." The inspector made a note. The sound of the pen was louder than it should have been. Neighbors watch. Word spread quickly. Not in panicked whispers, but curious ones. People stepped onto porches, stood near windows, pretended to check mail. This wasn't gossip. This was something different. For years, the HOA had been untouchable. Now it was being examined. Marilyn's house. The inspection route followed the system logically, which meant it eventually reached Marilyn's property. She insisted on accompanying the inspectors. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Questions were asked. Answers didn't align. Then came the pause. One of the inspectors compared two documents. Another stepped aside to make a call. Marilyn's smile faltered. The moment of understanding. When the inspector returned, he spoke calmly. "There appear to be modifications here," he said. "These require documentation." Marilyn shook her head slightly. "That's impossible," she said. Everything was approved. The inspector didn't argue. He simply asked for proof. There was none. Procedure takes over. At that point, the inspection stopped being about Ethan, or even Marilyn. It became about compliance. Temporary restrictions were issued. Follow-up reviews scheduled. Notices prepared. All standard. All public. The irony wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. The rules Marilyn had enforced so carefully now applied to her first. The board fractures. An emergency HOA meeting was called that evening. Attendance was higher than ever. Questions came from directions Marilyn wasn't used to. Board members asked about processes. about transparency, about selective enforcement. Marilyn tried to regain control, but control requires trust. And trust had quietly left the room. Ethan speaks. When Ethan was asked to speak, the room fell silent. He stood slowly. I didn't ask for special treatment, he said. I asked for consistency. That was all.
No accusations. No emotion.
The words settled like weight. The decision. By the end of the meeting, no votes were taken. But something irreversible had happened. Marilyn no longer spoke as authority. She spoke as defense. And everyone could hear the difference. The night after, Ethan returned home that night exhausted. Not relieved. Not triumphant. Just tired. But when he sat in his living room, listening to the familiar quiet of the neighborhood, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Balance. The process was still unfolding, but the direction was set. The neighborhood didn't change all at once. There was no announcement, no dramatic email, no public admission of fault. Instead, there was a pause. The kind of pause that follows when a system realizes it has been exposed, not through anger but through clarity. For the first time since Ethan moved into Brookstone Ridge, the silence felt different. It wasn't oppressive. It was reflective. In the days following the inspection, people moved more slowly. Neighbors lingered longer at mailboxes. Conversations resumed where they had once stopped short. People looked at one another again, not cautiously, but curiously. The HOA sent fewer emails. When they did, the tone had changed. Words like compliance, review, and update replaced violation and enforcement. Ethan noticed immediately. Marilyn withdraws. Marilyn Cross stopped appearing in public spaces. Her house remained quiet. The blinds stayed drawn longer than usual. Her name appeared less frequently in communications, replaced by generic titles and shared signatures. When she did speak at meetings, her voice no longer carried the same authority. It wasn't that people challenged her outright. It was that they no longer deferred. Power, Ethan realized, doesn't disappear loudly. It dissolves. Repairs begin. The work crews arrived without ceremony. No letters.
No explanations.
Just quiet, methodical restoration. Ethan watched from his window as systems were adjusted, connections reviewed, and long-ignored issues finally addressed. No one apologized directly. But the work itself felt like an acknowledgement. Each small improvement made his house feel more like a home again. Not perfect, but honest. The unexpected visit. One afternoon, a knock came at Ethan's door. He opened it to find a neighbor he barely knew, a man who had once avoided eye contact entirely. I wanted to say something, the man said, shifting uncomfortably. I should have spoken up earlier. Ethan nodded. I didn't know how, the man continued. Most of us didn't. Ethan understood. Fear doesn't need threats to work. It only needs precedent. The board's decision. The HOA board met privately. Then again. Then publicly. This time, Marilyn sat at the end of the table. When the announcement came, it was brief. Marilyn Cross was stepping down as president, effective immediately. No reasons were listed. None were needed. The room was quiet, not celebratory, not tense. Just still. Transition. Interim leadership was appointed.
Policies were reviewed. Committees formed.
The language of the HOA shifted from enforcement to responsibility. People asked questions now. They expected answers. And for the first time, they got them. Ethan's home. The final adjustments at Ethan's house were completed on a quiet Thursday morning. He tested the systems slowly.
Carefully.
Almost cautiously. Everything worked. He stood alone in his kitchen listening, not for problems, but for normalcy. The hum of a functioning home. It felt unfamiliar. And then it felt like relief. A letter, at last. A letter arrived a week later. Not a notice. Not a warning. A statement. We acknowledge that prior handling of your concerns did not meet community standards. Corrective actions have been taken to prevent recurrence.
No signatures.
No names. Ethan folded the letter and placed it in his archive. Not out of bitterness. Out of closure. Seeing Marilyn again. Ethan saw Marilyn one final time at a distance. She was walking alone, no clipboard, no agenda. Just a resident now. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. What passed between them wasn't victory or resentment. It was recognition. What the neighborhood learned. Brookstone Ridge didn't become perfect. No community ever does. But it became aware. Rules were still enforced, but now they were visible. Leadership still existed, but it was questioned. And silence was no longer mistaken for agreement. What Ethan learned. Ethan didn't feel proud. He didn't feel vindicated. What he felt was lighter. He learned that patience could be strength. That documentation could be protection. That fairness didn't require force, only persistence. Most of all, he learned that a quiet response can sometimes travel farther than a loud one ever could. The final evening. One evening, weeks later, Ethan sat on his porch as the sun set behind the identical rooftops. The lights came on one by one. The neighborhood breathed. For the first time since the beginning, Ethan wasn't thinking about the HOA. He was thinking about what came next. And that, he realized, was the point. Final line, long-form close. The HOA had tried to control him by blocking what lay beneath his home. But in the end, it was their own system, built on selective rules and quiet pressure, that revealed the truth. And once revealed, it could never be hidden again.